going to be talking about whether we turn our engineers blue. That's right, it's a blue team talk. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about how we make everyone sad all of the time. For those of you that were at the panel yesterday afternoon, you may hear some snippets that sound familiar to you. I'm hoping not to really repeat anything, but otherwise just give a little bit more detail and a little bit more context. Before I start, I'm going to talk a lot about our delivery teams and our engineers, but I want to take a moment to ask you all to have some empathy for our teams. And if you are here and you're a developer or in your operations, I want to ask you to have some empathy for our security teams. Originally in our careers, we were quite siloed. Whether you're a developer or a security person, you were a DBA, a front-end engineer. You were a security architect focusing on a specific point. And then all of a sudden, we've been expected to become a mile wide and a mile deep. Engineers are configuring Docker containers, Kubernetes clusters. They're expected to know about network protocols, how to properly configure databases. As security engineers, we're expected to know about a vast range of technologies, and it happened like that. And so I'm going to talk about things that I've seen so far whilst working both in big financial services and small companies that have helped me along the way to create blue teams. But alongside all of that is an element of empathy for our peers. So a quick intro about me. I work for Moonpig. There's about 300 people total at Moonpig. And before Moonpig, I was at Capital One working for their US bank function, of which I think there's 40,000 employees. So it's been a big difference for me. In between that, Moonpig were owned by Photobox Group, and many of you might have known my previous CISO, Dennis Cruz, who I've learned an amazing amount from. And so I kind of gradually made this transition from huge conglomerate enterprise function with an insane budget to a Moonpig security team whereby it's what can you do for free, which I imagine is something we can all relate to. I'm one of the co-founders for OWASP We Are London. We call it We Are London, but it's a space in which we try and create an inclusive and welcoming AppSec area where you can go and you can learn and you can speak. So especially for those of you that might be first-time speakers and want to come up here and talk next year, of which I'd encourage you to do reach out to me, because we're always looking for speakers at We Are London. The last thing I want to mention before I kick off, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it when I have such a great platform, is that there are so many ways as security folks that we can use our skills to contribute back to open source projects. And especially for those of you that are perhaps non-developers that don't consider yourselves as an engineer, you can do some really cool and neat things with your skills. Everything from doing security reviews of open source projects all the way through to giving advice and guidance to teams. More recently, I've been applying security principles outside of tech altogether, and I've been working on a project to use data around poachers in African game reserves to try and defer poachers and try and properly zone in on where our game rangers should be. And we've been doing that using threat modeling principles. So we've been taking data about the weather, road conditions, animal migration, audio from gunshots, using a whole load of low-tech capabilities to then use our threat modeling skills. What are we doing? What can go wrong? What can we do about it? To tell our gamekeepers where to go so that we can better utilize the tech that we have to protect against poachers. And so there's so many great ways you can use your skills, and I'd really encourage you to do so. All right, on to the blue team stuff. So I'm going to cover off a huge range of things. The things I'm going to cover are all open source or ideation or free things that I do. There's a load of great products, but everything I cover off is free, and so I'm not going to mention any vendors if I can help it. I'm going to cover off a load of things that work for me. I'm also, to be true to my own ethics, going to show you one thing that didn't work for me, because I think it's always fair to show you where I failed. But hopefully you'll find it funny and inspirational at the same time, at least if only to make me feel a little bit better. So the first thing is security champions. So Dennis Cruz, who I mentioned earlier, has an amazing talk on security champions. And so what I'm going to really do is cover off a little bit in complementary to that. But security champions are what I like to call my security pyramid scheme. So, or my Ponzi scheme. As I mentioned, I'm in a very small team, and so I can't be everywhere at once. And so the way I utilize security champions are to be my extended team. And so I purposefully put in probably more time than maybe someone else would into our security champions so that they can be our extended team, but they don't come out of our budget, which is super. And so that they can help move that along. And the biggest way that we've done that is we have an engineering operating model at Moonpig, a way of working as such for all engineering teams, and security has become a huge part of that operating model. And then equally, things like time to resolve vulnerabilities has become part of those teams' KPIs. So we've started to embed it in culture, both with the support of leadership team and with the engineers themselves, and that's been a huge benefit in getting security champions to work. We've also done a load of stuff around specific training for our security champions. We've tried to gamify it. We've done hackathons and capture the flags. We've done bug bashes. There was a point in time during the Moonpig and PhotoBox split where we got a couple of engineers from both teams, and we got Moonpig engineers to try and hack the PhotoBox website, and PhotoBox engineers to try and hack the Moonpig website, which is a really good, fun way of gamifying. And it's something I'd encourage you to think about in your test environments, is getting different services teams to try and get each other's stuff. The reason it's so good is because they'll have their own idea of vulnerabilities they have, and so they'll try the same exploits against each other. And it's been a really good way for us to validate some of the assumptions we had about vulnerabilities with teams. And the other way we've done this is we started to work with engineers to create patterns. So what we've done is every time someone asks us a question, or they've asked us for support on a security topic, is we've used that as a chance to create a wiki or a pattern, an architecture pattern, and we've built that up with them and then made it consumable. The idea is to answer a question once, but answer it well, but then also be open to iterating over it continuously, continuous improvement. Okay. So the other thing that we've been building a lot of are hand-to-mouth resources. So again, small team, not many security people, and the idea of this is we want there to be a way for engineers to be able to quickly consume the answers they want, but also for our wider Moonpig team, our marketing team, our C-level, our admins, how to quickly make easily consumable guidance. And so phishing has been a huge thing for us. Some of you might have seen the NCSC guidance recently on the huge increase in phishing scams, both targeted at individuals and businesses. And so we did some really quick, simple, super simple, because I'm not a designer, infographics for our teams to see. And we just put these in Slack channels and pinned them. We printed them and put them around the office. And again, they were really simple, quick ways to get teams thinking about it. The other thing we've started to do is we've started to create some of these on top tips for securing your Kubernetes cluster, and quick and easy consumable infographics. We've also started to create those wikis. So I mentioned about security patterns, but every time we answer a question, we're creating a wiki as well. We are using a mixture, and we're trying to decide where they sit, if it's Confluence or GitHub pages. And I said I would talk about free tooling, so GitHub is a great place to store them, but quick checklists and wikis. And again, it's where teams are starting to adopt certain technologies. They can go somewhere and quickly go, okay, what's the right thing to do about securing my API, or using Postgres databases, or building with Lambda functions, whatever it might be. And we've also started doing AMAs. I was definitely inspired by Reddit on this, but the idea was to have a Slack channel where people can ask us anything, but also having the ability to consume anonymous questions using Slido. There's always an element of risk, so I'd recommend not putting it on the screen behind you. But the idea was that teams could ask us questions without fear of throwing their service under the bus, as it were, or really holding the security team accountable for what they felt they were or weren't doing well, or at all, so they could get some feedback to us quickly. And so doing AMAs and open door sessions have been really helpful for us. So on to the good stuff. This is Tim. This is my husband. He said I could put a picture on of him if people couldn't see his face, so challenge accepted. I've been doing threat modeling for a little while now, and those of you that have heard me talk before or have seen me at meetups, I love threat modeling. It's a very creative way, I feel, of trying to work out all the things that can go wrong with something. And so it became very natural for me to threat model. I feel like I'm always thinking about things that can go wrong. And a great example for me is when Tim wanted to propose, we were on our way on holiday. We were going to South Africa, and we were at the airport in London Heathrow. And he was getting a bit flustered and a bit sweaty before we got to security, and I couldn't really work out why. And I'm like, we're going on holiday. And he was just like, oh my God, we've got to go through security. And I'm like, relax. And he looked at me and said, I'll race you. And I'm very competitive. And so I just left him at airport security and just kind of ran, but also walked, because I didn't want to get stopped by anyone thinking I looked a bit suspicious, as far away from him as possible so that I could find the right queue to get through, where there was no one with pushchairs in front of me, no one with big boots, anyone that was going to slow me down. And so I was thinking about all the things that could go wrong that could stop me from winning, from beating my husband getting through airport security. And at the same time, for Tim, he was thinking about all the things that could go wrong when he realized he had a ring box in his backpack, and they were probably going to ask him to open it so they could see inside. And so he thought he was going to have to propose in the middle of Heathrow Terminal 5. And so he was thinking about all the things that could go wrong, and we're both thinking, okay, what can we do about it? What can we mitigate in this solution? Long story short, we both got through successfully. He didn't have to propose next to an old man putting his trainers back on, and we did get engaged later on in the holiday. But for me, it was a way of kind of reaffirming that in many life situations, we're always thinking about what we're doing, what can go wrong, what can we do about it, and how do we make sure we do a good job. And there's a whole load of frameworks that support this. And I'm going to touch on this only very lightly, because I want to tell you a better story about how I'm applying threat modeling and what I'm doing about it. But these are just a few resources, and specifically I want to point you through to some talks, and I'll make sure these slides are available. But there are so many people that do some really great talks on these, and Arius Risk out in the hallway have a free newsletter they do that always points you to the latest talk that they've seen, and it's very good. So I think about threat modeling, and I think about all the ways that I can apply it. And one of the things that I got really excited about was this idea of, when we do a threat model, we come up with all these vulnerabilities related to a service. And these vulnerabilities are only true because there's a specific characteristic in your service. And so I started to think about how, if I have these vulnerabilities, then perhaps I can start to say, well, they're always there because of these characteristics. And if I can sanitize ever so slightly these vulnerabilities, so I don't tell everyone all the ways in which to hack Moonpig, then maybe I can create a service where I can just pull in different services or different tools or technologies, and it will auto-populate vulnerabilities for me. So I got kind of excited about this, and I thought, I'm going to try and build it. And so I thought this is going to be a great complementary tool to SAST and DAST, of which I am not a fan. And the idea is that you can do this as early on in your design process as possible, and then use it to drive decisions on how you build your tool and how you progress with your service, what design route you go down when you're coming up with a new service. And so I started to think about how I would build it. And I am going to talk briefly about JIRA, so forgive me. But I did work for Dennis for a long time. He loves JIRA. And so this is where we stored information about vulnerabilities. And what would happen is we had specific workflows. We took every vulnerability that we found, and we put it in JIRA, and we linked it to IT assets, and we linked it to risks, and we had workflows for approvals. We had lots of things. But most importantly, it was effectively a database. It was a bit naughty to use it like a graphical database, but we did. And so we put all our vulnerabilities in there, and then there is an open source Slack bot called OSBot on the OWASP GitHub that you can utilize, and that takes data from JIRA or wherever your database is, ships it off to Elasticsearch, and then we had a Lambda function that we could use to query that data in Elasticsearch and then spit it out back to Slack. And the idea was I could say, hey, Slack, show me all the vulnerabilities related to X. I'm like, and the reason that they built this was just to make risk a lot easier to talk about at Photobox whilst we were there, and at Moonpig too. And so I thought, maybe I can use this for like my pre-cognitive minority report style threat modeling, where I can just type in an IT asset or a service, and I can see all the vulnerabilities. And so I got really excited about it. And as you can see, initially it didn't work super well, but it gave me an idea. And the idea was, well, if I can see an IT asset, and then I can see a load of vulnerabilities, what I can also start to see is my mitigation options. And whilst this isn't super useful like this, what it gave me the idea of was that I could start to think about how to smartly go after the right mitigation at the right time. And one of the things that we had a problem with is we would get a whole list of vulnerabilities from a threat model or from a pen test. And we would give them a criticality, critical, high, medium, low. But what we wouldn't do is say, hey, you've got this high and you've got this high, or all of these, and you've got fixes, and they t-shirt size their fixes. But what we wouldn't do is say, if you did fix 1, that would fix 1 high vuln. But if you did fix 2, that would fix 5 high vulnerabilities. And so we weren't smartly telling our engineers what to go after. And the hope is always they'll fix every vulnerability. But as we know, they've got a limited amount of time. And product owners love to risk accept stuff. And so I started to think about how we could use this to drive the right decisions, how to properly allocate resources and make sure we're fixing the right things at once. And so I'm starting to think, OK, I can use this graphical database, JIRA, and I can use our Slack bot to start to give this information to engineers. I just have to visualize it in the right way. And so I experimented with it. This is a taxonomy from Sysnet. It's a great taxonomy for threats. But it's quite complex, and so I thought, I'm going to start simple, because already the graphs looked a bit confusing, and they were a bit mad, but incredibly useful, probably one of the best taxonomies I've seen for quantifying threats, risks, vulnerabilities, attack surfaces, and defects, bugs, flaws, or what our product owners like to call features. And what I did is I created a slightly simpler version, and you'll have to forgive, there's a couple of pictures here from directly in my notebook, because I'm just not a huge fan of Lucidchart at the moment. And what I did is I simplified it a little bit just to call out the things that I wanted to represent initially. And I thought, OK, I'm going to use this Slack tool that Dennis has built, and I'm going to start to create my minority report threat model. And so I thought about what it could look like. And I did a quick POC, and I used plant UML just to demonstrate what it could be, whilst I was kind of still pitching this idea to the team about, because they still thought it was a little bit crazy when I started talking about Tom Cruise every day. And I started to say, hey, you could pull in data from CVE databases, from your security tooling, from NCSC guidance, whatever it is, from threat models, and then you can start to talk about mitigations, and you can talk about how to go after the right mitigations. And so we ran it. We used Slackbot, we queried JIRA, of which I put a lot of data into JIRA, and I gave it a go. And the first result was this, of which isn't totally useful. I'm like, that's fine, because there's a whole load of libraries out there for visualizing the data that I'm getting, so I'll just use a different library. And it turned out like this. And I'm like, that's OK, because clearly there's too much data in there, and then it's just not helpful if there's too much data. So I reduced the scope of data and tried a different way of visualizing. And I came up with this, which is probably one of my more favorite ones. And so for me, I'm still on the journey of getting to my kind of pre-cognitive way of visualizing threats. And ultimately, coming back to the impact I wanted to have at Moonpig and at Photobox was really just around driving the right fix at the right time. And so I took a step back. I went back to plant UML, because then I can still do all of my diagrams as code, and it can still be in GitHub, and started to go back to the threat models that we were doing and making sure we were bringing in the right data at the right time. And so I realized that if I use basic data, I'm getting basic results, and that it just wasn't the right way of querying that information, and that I needed to write some better logic to make sure that I wasn't pulling in false positives or irrelevant data. And so I parked it, moved it towards what will be an open source project, and said, OK, that's not the right thing for right now. How else can I use threat modeling at Moonpig to drive impact as quickly as possible? And so the thing that I want to talk about, and what some of you might have seen from the synopsis of this talk, is how I use threat modeling for incidents instead. Those that have known me for a while will know that I'm not a fan of attack trees. I've kind of always thought they were elegant solutions to a problem that no one has, until I found the problem, at least for me. And so I want to give you a really quick rundown of attack trees. I've got a couple here. What attack trees do is they follow the possible or impossible paths, and they allow you to understand kind of the ways in which you would get into something. And then we've got over here another way of doing it where you call out special equipment, required or no special equipment required. And the way I translate that to cyber is no special knowledge, for example, knowing how to craft the packet or the API request properly or whatever it might be. And so I started to think about how we would use attack trees. And one of the ways I started to investigate was in incident response. I mentioned we have a small team. At Moonpig, the security team is just me at the moment, but we are hiring. But we still utilize the PhotoBox security team, of which there is an incident response team, but it's very, very small. And so when we see responses that are required, often the security engineering function support them. And so what we started to do was utilize attack trees. So I'm going to ask you to think of an incident that you've had. You can spin the incident wheel and pick many of them that are out there. Some of the recent reports have shown us that phishing is still up there. But effectively, any incident can utilize attack trees if you're still trying to understand what happened. And so what we started to do is we extended our incident response team for what we considered several incidents. And we started to bring in, as needed, because we still want to be respectful of their time, our AppSec teams, our engineering teams, our SOC analysts, infrastructure engineers, a whole range of people. Effectively, everyone you would use in a normal threat model when you're still coming up with a design for a product. And so what we did during an incident is we started to think about, OK, what do we know about what's happened? And sometimes that's very little information. I've just got a blank diagram up here for some infrastructure. But effectively, you have an incident. You're still trying to understand what happened. All you really know is the bottom of that attack tree. You just know the impact, right? You know, I don't know, your CloudFront subdomain has been hijacked, or you have had some data exposed to the internet, or all you've had so far is maybe an email from a journalist saying, we found some of your data online, whatever it might be. And so we start to think about what we know. What we then started to do with attack trees is quantify all of the attack vectors that could have contributed to that incident. So the idea is that your incident teams are still going through their playbooks, they're still going through their root cause analysis. But what we're doing is we're relying on that extended knowledge of the AppSec teams, the delivery teams, to run through all the possible and impossible attack vectors. And I'm going to cover off why we should capture the impossible. But the idea is that you would also go through your no special knowledge or no special equipment attack tree paths as well. And the idea is to quickly or more quickly direct your SOC analysts into which route they should go to when they're looking through their logs or when they're running their playbooks. And so it's something we've used, not in every incident, I'll be honest, but it's certainly in our Sev1 or Sev2 incidents where we're still trying to understand what happened, what caused this. And interestingly, I've started to see some of our engineers use these in normal technical incidents as well. So when they see sites go down, or when they've seen an unusual amount of load for our Kubernetes clusters, whatever it might be, we've started to see them run through all the various things that could have gone wrong. Even what they might cover off as the impossible, start to rule that out and then go through, OK, what's the most likely vector? And then they've used that to determine where they spend the most effort in investigating first. I mentioned that I captured the impossible on here. The reason I do that is it might be impossible at a point in time because of something you've implemented. But we all know, as security folk or developers, that fixes are often removed in future releases to production. And so we know that what's impossible now might not be impossible in the future. And so moving on to some other tools and tricks that we've been giving our engineers to help make them a little bit more blue team is we started to use security tests. And this is a snapshot from Fraser Scott's cloud security project, which is an open source OWASP project. But the idea of capturing the impossible in your attack tree is to start to quantify, how do I know it's impossible, and how do I continuously validate that it's still impossible today to make sure that we're still protected. And so writing security tests in any form, whether it's BDD tests, whether it's using the same languages, Cucumber, Dan at the front here can talk about a load more about testing than I can, as can Alyssa at our keynote yesterday. But the idea is that you can continuously write tests to validate, is that fix still there? And it's something I would encourage engineers to do, but our security teams to support them in. One of the other things we've started to do, and I talked about my pyramid scheme of our engineers and deliveries to make them our extended security team, is taking testing a bit further to upskill our teams for more dynamic testing. And so I started to look into test charters or explorative testing. And the idea is that you take a project or a service, use a tool or a framework, and you try and discover something. And often this is used more for feature testing or functionality testing, where you don't have a specific thing you're testing for. But what we started to do was give our engineers some training on tools like Zap. And the idea was, or even Burp Suite, loads of different tools. And the idea was to get them a little bit more comfortable with those tools and looking for vulnerabilities. And so they still had their attack trees. They had their concept of threat modeling. What am I doing? What can go wrong? What can I do about it? And did I do a good job? And then they start to go through that to discover vulnerabilities. And it helped us to continue to upskill our software engineers. But it also meant that we were starting to find more and more vulnerabilities during the testing phase of our releases. There's a whole load of information and a really great blog post on Medium on test charters, which I'd encourage you to look at if it's something that interests you. The other thing that's been really successful for us in getting engineers to be more blue team are POCs. And so what I've started to do is go around to showcases and guilds, existing meetings with our engineering teams. It's been really important for me to not add more meetings to their calendar, but to be a part of their existing process, and to do POCs. And the reason I do that is it's very easy for us as security folk to say, you've got this risk, or you've got this vulnerability, and it is high. And it is high because I use this framework to quantify it using these 10 areas, and this number is 1 to 10. And so it very quickly becomes confusing for both your teams and your product owners on why something is high and why they should care about it. And so we've started doing POCs to do a really quick, it's a little bit of a scare tactic, but I like it, but really quick and easy demos to say, this is why you should care. This is how easy it is to exploit, and this is why we need to fix. And so some of the ones that we've been showing are CloudFront subdomain takeovers or Route 53 takeovers. Badly configured DNS is a huge cause of subdomain takeovers. And S3 buckets, there's a great website. It's totally legal, depending on what you do with it. It's called Grey Hat Warfare, and what it allows you to do is search public S3 buckets. So it enumerates the S3 bucket domain space to look for buckets that are open to the internet, and you can search on keywords. So I searched on credentials.csv yesterday, just to check that the numbers were still up to date, and I had well over 1,100 results for files in public S3 buckets that were credentials.csv. For those of you that use AWS, if you download your access key and secret key for use with the API or the CLI, it downloads as a file called credentials.csv. And so a lot of people, for whatever reason, seem to be uploading these back to S3 and not locking down their public buckets. And we talk about public buckets a lot, and people often are like, yeah, I know I need to lock it down, but what's the chance of them finding my bucket that's weirdly named or randomly named or doesn't say my company name, whatever. But actually, this tool doesn't care how complex your bucket name is. It just enumerates through that whole namespace. And so I got a lot of results. I can tell you that we were able to validate a lot of these credentials were valid, and where possible, we told people. But it was a really interesting way to demonstrate to our product owners in the room of how easy it is to find data. There are some other interesting keywords I searched around customer files, around financial records. Some of these weren't just public read, a lot of them were public write. And so where I was able to find static files related to websites, I would have been able to deface a whole load of sites at the same time. And so that was a really easy demonstration. I would encourage you to spend time POCing the vulnerabilities that you find and you talk about with your teams, because they don't understand your risk management framework. I would challenge you about whether you understand your risk management framework well. And so if you want people to take the things you find seriously, this is really important. But it's also important as a way of upskilling your teams on how they would check for these things as well. The other thing, and I mentioned this to a couple of people yesterday, it's been really valuable for me, are working groups. Now, conferences like this are super, but the networking part sometimes I find really hard. I'd love to think I'm an extrovert, but I have what my friend jokes is people hangovers, which is if I spend too much time with lots of other people, the next day I kind of just need to sit and be quiet for a bit and just kind of not talk to anyone. And so sometimes it's hard in these conferences to find the right person that has the same problem as you to have that conversation. And so working groups is something that Francois and Dennis introduced me to. And it's this idea of finding people that have a similar issue to you or a similar interest, but perhaps a conflicting idea of how they would approach it or a complementary mindset, whatever it might be. And the idea is you have an informal session, Chatham House rules, but the idea is whatever you produce and the output of that is under Creative Commons. And so it's a great way to get together and say, how do we fix security culture, which is a big question, or how do we create a risk framework that is translatable to product owners? And so the idea is you get a few people together and you effectively just work on a project and then you put it out there for everyone else to contribute to after. The Open Security Summit that happened earlier this year and last year were great ways of doing that, but I would encourage you to reach out to your network and ask them to spread the word. If there's a problem or a challenge you have, these are a great way to address them and to go after them. The other thing I would ask you to do is that when you are in the networking sessions, because many of you may have only come with one person, is try and introduce them to someone else, but make a meaningful introduction. So rather than just, hey, Dan, this is Tony, Tony, this is Dan, try and identify people that you think have complementary mindsets. So Alyssa, our keynote yesterday, is really interested in the testing world. I have a friend here that came from the testing world that has great contacts, and so we were able to make that introduction. And these introductions are so powerful for people's journey and for expanding people's knowledge in this space. And so my very first DevSecCon, someone did the same for me. And it's a great way of expanding your network, finding your working group, and being able to continue to build on those topics. The other thing I've done is, whilst I've been working through all of these quick kind of ways to make people blue team, is I constantly sync back to impact. When I'm thinking about security champions, proof of concepts, threat modeling, using attack trees, working groups, all of these things, I've started to quantify what's the impact, and is it the right thing to be going after right now? So I looked at individual impact, team. I've talked about brand and group, but effectively that's line of business, entire business, and then industry, and you can kind of phrase it however you want. But the idea was to continuously reflect and say, is this having the impact that it needs to have right now? Is this the right thing to work on? And then I've been getting feedback from our product teams as to, is the roadmap that I have having the right impact? Is it meaningful? It's so easy for us as security folk to drive our own roadmap or the things that we want to do with our teams based on our own perspective without seeking the perspective of our wider teams. And one of the things that I quite like about what Amazon do is when they go into their quarterly planning, they post on Twitter, a lot of the teams, and they do feature requests. The Lambda team do it well. The Elasticsearch team, maybe not so well. I've got a lot of feature requests for them. But the idea is to constantly seek that feedback and make sure you're having the right impact. And so there's a whole load of resources that I've kind of covered off really quickly, or things that have helped me on my journey. And again, the idea are quick and easy tools that are easy to utilize, easy to onboard. My only caveat on this list is SecurityMonkey. Netflix, I love your tools, but God, your documentation is awful. And so the idea, if you're going to ask your engineers to utilize any tooling, any open source tooling, is make sure you've used it yourself. Make sure that it's clear that it adds value, that it has the right impact that you want. But there are loads of free resources out there that can just help to make your delivery teams that little bit more blue team and continue to upskill them. So there's loads of stuff there. I tend to tweet a lot of resources and links to these as well, so do feel free to ask me any questions after if I've mentioned any that you like. But that's it. Thank you guys so much for coming and for hearing me talk. I am going to be around for questions, but I am going to ask that you come and find me out there and grab me, because I don't want to hold you up or hold the next speaker up. But thank you so much.